Fukushima Daiichi. That name, it still carries a lot of weight, doesn't it?
It really does. More than a decade later. And the accident there, well, it's still front and center in the debate here in Japan about nuclear power.
Yeah, the whole question of restarting reactor safety concerns, it's complex. You hear about the public anxiety, the operational challenges. It's a huge issue.
Absolutely. And it's those complexities, those layers, that we really want to peel back today in this deep dive.
We're not just skimming the surface here.
No, the aim is to get a much deeper understanding of what happened, what it really means for Japan's energy path forward, give you that richer picture.
And for this, we're drawing on some, frankly, incredible insights from a discussion with Dr. Charles Casto.
Right, Dr. Casto, former U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission administrator.
But the key thing is he actually led the U.S. NRC response team in Japan right after the accident hit. He was there.
Exactly. So he wasn't just getting reports secondhand. He experienced the crisis unfolding on the ground. That direct experience, plus his background in nuclear safety, crisis management, it's a very unique perspective.
It really is. So the goal for us today is to move past the headlines, to really unpack the crisis, the lessons learned, and crucially, the challenges Japan is still grappling with as it thinks about restarting its nuclear plants safely.
And it's not just the technical side, the engineering. We'll be looking at the societal impact, the policy choices, that whole balance of power issue between regulators, operators, the government. It's all interconnected.
A multidimensional puzzle, like you said. Okay, so let's dive in. Right after the earthquake and tsunami, Dr. Casto talked about getting the call. It was incredibly fast. He said something like 3 hours notice to get his passport, get on a plane to Tokyo. Just shows the urgency, right?
Absolutely. That kind of speed, it highlights how even the best laid plans can be overwhelmed. You need immediate high-level action when something that big hits so suddenly.
And it wasn't just officials feeling the weight of it all. He told a story about the flight crew on his plane to Japan. They recognized the situation, apparently moved him up to first class, and spent hours asking him about the accident, worried about radiation, even just flying near Japan.
Wow. That anecdote, it really hits home, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The level of global anxiety Fukushima sparked, it wasn't just Japan's problem. The fear spread worldwide.
He also made an interesting point about the situation itself. He called it unique, one developed first world nation helping another with this natural technology disaster, he termed it, with these long-term cross-border impacts.
That's a key distinction. It wasn't like typical disaster relief or humanitarian aid.
Right.
The world has protocols for, say, earthquakes or floods. But a major technological crisis within a highly developed country, that pose completely new challenges, especially for coordinating help and, crucially, information across borders.
Which leads right into a massive challenge he faced, getting reliable information, especially in those first few days. He used this really stark analogy like solving a murder case without access to the crime scene.
That really paints a picture. Imagine trying to respond effectively when you just don't have the basic facts. And he pointed out the reactor information systems themselves were damaged.
So it wasn't necessarily secrecy, but
a genuine lack of data. They couldn't get reliable readings. The systems were compromised by the disaster itself.
And there was this weird disconnect he mentioned. The world was watching TV pictures, real-time updates. He called it the first web-streamed nuclear accident.
Right.
But inside the plant, the workers were apparently struggling to get basic info on what was happening in the reactors.
That highlights a critical failure point, doesn't it? The internal monitoring systems, the things you rely on most in an emergency, they were knocked out. And even the data that was available, like thermal imaging, interpreting unfamiliar data streams under pressure. Easy to get it wrong.
And just getting the U.S. and Japanese teams coordinated took time. He figured about 10 days. To establish what he called a battle rhythm for sharing info, giving advice effectively.
10 days. That really underscores the difficulty of international collaboration mid-crisis. You need those protocols, that common language, established before disaster strikes, not figured out on the fly.
But maybe one of the most profound things Dr. Casto said about the immediate aftermath, he insisted there weren't just 3 crises.
Right, not just earthquake, tsunami, nuclear event.
He said there were 5. He specifically added a societal crisis and a policy crisis.
And that's such a crucial reframing. It forces you to see the impact beyond the purely technical. It wasn't just about the reactors failing.
It was about the public fear, the loss of trust.
Exactly, the societal crisis. And then the policy crisis, looking at the frameworks, the regulations, the government response structures that were maybe inadequate or contributed to the problem. To really fix things, he argued, you have to tackle all five. They're all linked.
Let's dig into that policy crisis bit more. Dr. Casto mentioned the history of Japan's electricity system, how power was pretty concentrated with the big utilities, even before nuclear became big.
Yeah, he suggested that historical concentration might have sort of skewed the balance, potentially impacting how regulation worked, how emergency response was structured. When a few players have that much influence,
it can be harder to get truly independent oversight.
that's the potential risk, yes. Which ties into his thoughts on the current balance of power. He acknowledges the regulator, the NRA, has a lot more authority now. But he stresses it needs to be a shared responsibility. It can't just be the regulator.
So who else needs to be involved?
Well, the operators themselves, obviously. They need to truly own safety. Go beyond just ticking boxes for compliance. Aim for operational excellence. Be clearly responsible.
Okay, regulator, operator.
And elected officials. They have a huge role. Listening to the public, providing that emergency response structure, and crucially,
What's that?
leading a national conversation about risk.
Ah, okay. A public dialogue.
Exactly. Dr. Casto believes society needs to discuss and decide what level of risk from nuclear power is acceptable. Then, elected officials should take that consensus and put it into law.
So the regulator regulates within boundaries set by the public via politicians.
Precisely. The acceptable risk level shouldn't just be a technical decision made by the regulator alone. And ultimately, he feels public acceptance is the bottom line. If people don't feel the risks are managed acceptably,
then moving forward is incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
right, which ties directly into restarting plants.
What needs to happen first, according to him?
Before anything else, the public needs to be convinced that the Fukushima Daiichi issues are genuinely resolved, that the lessons have truly sunk in. Trust has to be rebuilt.
And how do you do that?
He emphasized engaging society on emergency planning. The regulator needs to really prioritize and appreciate that societal dimension, not just focus on the hardware.
So dealing with those societal and policy crises he mentioned.
They're prerequisites. You can have the best technical fixes in the world, but if you haven't addressed the public trust issues and the policy weaknesses, restarting reactors faces a massive uphill battle.
Makes sense. Okay, so shifting to lessons learned more broadly. International protocols came up, right?
Yes, huge point. Better communication protocols, common terminology for transnational crises. He noted how different countries were using different emergency classifications during Fukushima.
Which must have caused confusion.
Absolutely. In a crisis, you need crystal clear, standardized language. Delays because people are using different terms. That can have serious consequences.
He also talked about the need for a robust incident command system.
Scalable, too. One that can grow to match the size of the crisis. His phrase was, as big as the accident.
Meaning it's too big for one person, or even a small group, to handle alone.
Exactly. You need coordination, clear roles, clear communication lines. Relying too heavily on just one or two people creates bottlenecks and risks mistakes.
Another recommendation was about information sources.
Right, the need for government to have its own independent sources of information right there at the nuclear sites.
Not just relying on the operators' reports.
Precisely. He mentioned that NISA, the regulator back then, had people, but maybe not assigned continuously to sites like in some other countries. Having independent government eyes and ears on site gives decision-makers unbiased, real-time data. That's crucial.
Dr. Casto also reflected a bit on how the U.S. changed after incidents like 3 Mile Island or 9/11, and sort of questioned whether Japan had adapted its safety culture and regulations quite as proactively over the years. He noted the U.S. tends to be quite self-critical after events, leading to regulatory changes.
It's a fair question about that cycle of learning and improvement. Are lessons from past incidents truly embedded globally? It speaks to needing ongoing critical self-assessment everywhere.
And you mentioned the U.S. concept of flex.
Yes, FLEX, flexible and diverse coping strategies. Basically having backup equipment, pumps, generators stored safely away from the plant, ready to be brought in if the site's own equipment is damaged.
The idea being
resilience. Ensuring the plant can remain safe for at least 72 hours, even if it's cut off from outside help because of, say, earthquake or tsunami damage to roads and infrastructure. That 72-hour window gives time for external resources to get there.
Okay, let's move into some specific questions that came up in the discussion. There was one about operator error, specifically about Mr. Yoshida, the late plant manager, and his understanding of some valves.
Yes, that came up. Dr. Casto was quite reluctant to judge. He emphasized the incredibly difficult, overwhelming conditions those operators were facing.
Understandable.
His point, I think, was that it's often more useful to look at potential systemic issues, training, procedures, the human-machine interface, rather than focusing solely on individual actions under extreme duress.
The complexity of managing multiple reactors on one site was also discussed.
Right, the idea that during a crisis, you almost need to treat each unit as its own separate challenge, with its own leadership team reporting up to an overall site command.
It's not just one big problem, but several simultaneous ones.
Exactly. Each needing focused attention and specific response plans within the bigger picture.
There's also a hypothetical raised. What if the political leadership had been different, say, Prime Minister Abe instead of Prime Minister Can? Would the response have changed?
Dr. Casto circled back to a point he'd made earlier.
The lack of independent information.
Precisely. He suggested that the absence of an independent, reliable information channel directly to the Prime Minister was likely a major factor shaping the government's response, regardless of who was actually in the top job at that moment.
So the system itself, or lack thereof, was maybe more critical than the individual leader in that specific context.
That seemed to be his implication, yes. Access to unbiased information is fundamental for any leader in a crisis.
Now, inevitably, rumors swirl after big events. One was addressed directly this idea the U.S. threatened to send 120 experts to the Prime Minister's office, can't tell.
Ah, yes. Dr. Casto clarified that. The U.S. did send a substantial team, about 150 people, he said, to the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo to provide technical support, logistical help.
But not threatening to barge into the PM's office.
No. He stated that specific claim was inaccurate. It's important to stick to the facts, especially when misinformation can spread so easily. His team worked out of the embassy, coordinating with the Japanese government.
And another point of speculation, did TEPSO ever consider just pulling out, abandoning the Daiichi site during the worst of it?
Dr. Casto indicated he didn't have direct knowledge of that. Whether that was ever seriously on the table remains, I suppose, a point of debate in different accounts of the crisis.
What is undeniable is the scale of the challenge TEPSO faced then, and still faces now with decommissioning.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, Dr. Casto mentioned his more recent visits to Fukushima Daiichi and also Daini, the nearby sister plant.
What were his impressions?
He noted significant progress, especially at Daiichi, with the very difficult decommissioning work. He specifically mentioned improvements in managing the groundwater contamination issue, which was huge.
It's an immense undertaking.
Immense. He expressed real respect for the leadership shown, mentioning Mr. Yoshida, of course, and also Mr. Masuda, who's been central to the decommissioning effort since. He acknowledged the incredible level of effort involved.
Good to hear about progress. Now, circling back to the societal and emergency planning aspects.
Yes, he really hammered this home. The need for that national risk discussion we talked about.
And better plans.
Realistic emergency plans. He stressed thinking about sheltering in place, especially for big cities where mass evacuation might just not be feasible, and much, much better public notification systems.
He contrasted Japan's system with its earthquake early warning system, right?
Exactly. The earthquake system is world-class, incredibly fast. The system for nuclear emergency notifications, he felt, was comparatively slow and needed significant improvement to be truly effective in a fast-moving crisis.
Okay, let's talk about Dr. Casto's own stance on nuclear power itself. How did he position himself?
Very clearly. He said he's pro-safety, not pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear intrinsically.
Safety first, last, and always.
That's the message. His view is that the technology's safety depends entirely on how it's managed, regulated, operated.
And the decision to use it or not.
That belongs to the public, he believes. Society has to weigh the risks and benefits and decide what's acceptable if a country does choose nuclear.
Then his focus is on helping them do it as safely as humanly possible.
Right. It puts the onus on public dialogue, transparency, informed consent.
He did offer a critique, though, of the current regulatory approach in Japan, didn't he?
He did. He expressed a perception, anyway, that perhaps the NRA, the current regulator, focuses quite heavily on paperwork, on documentation review. More than perhaps assessing actual human performance. How well do the teams perform under pressure in realistic simulated emergencies? Drills, exercises, performance-based checks.
So balancing the paper checks with observing real capability.
That seemed to be the gist of his observation. Ensuring the human element is robustly evaluated, not just the procedures on paper.
And finally, the topic of earthquakes. Predicting them, setting safety standards in a place like Japan.
Yeah, he acknowledged the inherent uncertainty. You can't predict earthquakes with perfect accuracy.
So you have to plan for uncertainty.
Exactly. Plan for scenarios where the quake might be bigger or different than predicted. Build in safety margins. He used that analogy. You don't want a fire in your house, right? You take precautions, even if you can't predict exactly when or if a fire might happen. Natural hazards carry inherent risks.
So preparedness for beyond design basis events is key.
Absolutely crucial for critical infrastructure like nuclear plants in seismically active zones.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, Fukushima was clearly just incredibly multifaceted. Technical failures, yes, but deeply intertwined with societal trust, policy frameworks.
Dr. Casto's perspective really highlights those connections and the lessons about crisis management, communication, the need for independent information, and really addressing those societal and policy dimensions, not just the engineering fixes.
And the challenges for Japan remain significant as it considers the path forward for nuclear energy.
It really boils down to rebuilding that public trust. Open dialogue, demonstrating an absolute commitment to safety in its broadest sense, technical, societal, governmental, and fostering that shared understanding of risks and benefits.
It definitely leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about that balance between technology, how much risk we as a society are willing to live with, and just how vital, transparent, effective governance is for safety in any complex, high-stakes field.
What level of risk are you comfortable with when you think about it? And how informed should that decision really be? It's a question for everyone.
A lot to mull over.
Indeed. And for listeners interested in digging even deeper, Dr. Casto has apparently shared more insights and lectures at places like Temple and Tokyo universities.
Good to know. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive today.
Our pleasure.
We hope this exploration of Dr. Casto's insights has given you a richer, more nuanced view of the Fukushima accident and the complex considerations shaping Japan's nuclear future.